All right, it's 11:01, so I think we can get started. Good morning, everyone. I think we may have a couple of new data officers joining us, so I will briefly introduce myself. My name is Melissa Mackey, and I am the Director of Research here at ILS. I want to thank you for joining us for today's data officer training. Today, we're going to be actually following up on the training that we did in April, where Caroline and Lucelle gave you an overview of what the performance measures were, and we answered lots of questions about that. And today, Caroline's going to give us an overview of the performance measure report that was generated with all of that information that you helped provide for us. Before we get started, though, I wanted to turn it over briefly to Riley Weinstein. She is, Riley, you can see her there. She is our new data outreach officer. And I think we had mentioned many times that while all of the counties were identifying and hiring and bringing on data officers, we were caught in a bit of a hiring freeze. And so we weren't able to bring Riley on for over a year, actually, but she's now here and she's going to start reaching out to each of you. So I just wanted to give Riley a moment to speak to everyone, and then she'll turn it over to Caroline and we'll get going.
Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be here, and thanks for coming today. As Melissa said, I'm reaching out to everybody to set up some individual calls just to get to know everybody a bit better. So if you haven't heard from me yet, you will soon, and I look forward to working with you all.
All right, well, thank you, Riley. Good to have you on board finally, because as Melissa said, you know, she had accepted the job as data officer, but then we had to wait for almost a full year for her to finally come on board. So we're so excited to have her with us. So what I'm going to do is I am going to share my screen, and because I prepared another PowerPoint for you guys. Let me put it in slideshow mode. There we go. This should work. So because we have some new data officers on the call, I will briefly introduce myself. My name is Caroline Kuipers. I am the senior researcher on the statewide implementation team, and I've been in that position since February 2020, so about 1.5 years now. And for those of you who more regularly attend these data officer trainings, I'm probably by now a familiar face, because one of my responsibilities is you know, conducting these data officer trainings with you all. First of all, before we go into the recap of the performance measures, I would like to thank you all so much for submitting your performance measures progress report to us. In fact, I'm very, very proud and very, very happy with the fact that ILS received the performance measures progress report from each of the 125 providers statewide from which ILS required one. So we got a progress report from everybody, and that is amazing. And that also is the reason why we were able to put together such a great annual report. And I will share the highlights of that report with you in a minute. So let's talk about the performance measures. A brief recap of what we did. As you all know, of course, individual links to the online survey, the online version of the performance measures progress report, were sent out to you all via email on April 2nd, 2021. And then the progress report was due April 30th, 2021. We required one submission per provider, and we asked you all to report data mostly over the last year. So we focused on the time period April 1st, 2020 through March 31st, 2021. Now, as you guys can see from the time period, that time period was deeply affected by the global pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And so some of the report findings will also actually discuss the findings in that context. So then, how is the information used? So you all received a link to the online survey. You all filled it out, which is amazing. And then, you know, the research team was left with a lot of data, a lot of responses provided with you. How did we use this information? Now, we used the information to put together what we call the annual performance measures report. And this annual report was actually sent to the New York State Division of Budget on May 28, 2021, so not very long ago. The annual report covers the 52 upstate counties and New York City, and in total represents 125 providers of mandated criminal representation. Now, just to be sure and to be very clear, providers engaging solely in family court representation, which are 11 of them, and another 11 of them, which are providers from the so-called HH counties that were involved in the initial lawsuits, they are not included in the following numbers. We did not include those in the performance measures annual report. Now, as I said, most of the numbers I will be presenting to you refer to the period of April 1st, 2020 to March 31st, 2021. So in other words, the last year. However, there's one exception. When I talk about attorney hires and non-attorney hires, we have actually explicitly asked you to report those hires since the start of implementation. And the start of statewide implementation was on April 1st, 2018. So when I present numbers on attorney hires and on non-attorney hires, I am actually reporting on hires over the past 3 years. So what do we do? What do we put in the annual report, and what is actually the purpose? Now, the annual performance measures report covers data on the progress of implementation of the statewide reforms. And we focus on progress of implementation in 3 specific areas. One is counsel at arraignment, one is caseload relief, and one is the overall improvement of the quality of public defense. The report includes both numbers as well as more qualitative info. And what that exactly means, you will see that later on in my presentation. The numbers are both in aggregate form, so saying something about New York State as a whole, but we also present numbers in the report specifically per county. And I will point out to you later during this training where you can find the county numbers if you're interested. So let's go to the first pillar, the first area of interest that the annual report covers, and that is counsel at arraignment. First, I would like to present to you some numbers, and these numbers are based on your responses, the responses that you gave in the performance measures progress report. So what I would like to start off with is quite an impressive number. Statewide, 393 new attorneys were hired who provide counsel at arraignment since the start of implementation, so in the past 3 years. If we focus on the last year only, so on that period of April 1st, 2020 to March 31st, 2021, we see that 109 new attorneys were hired who provide counsel at arraignment. And thinking about the time period, which was deeply impacted by COVID-19, and the fact that the counties and the providers were still able to hire new attorneys, in this specific case, new attorneys who provide counsel at arraignment, that's amazing, because we know that the COVID-19 pandemic also resulted in a number of hiring freezes, salary caps, all of that stuff. So this is amazing. What I would like to note, though, is that when we look at those attorney hires in the past year, we see that the majority of these attorney hires, to be precise, 63.3%, were placed on contract. And that was a much higher number. It was a much higher number of hires that were placed on contract compared to last year's annual report. And this shift in hiring type may be an accommodation to the COVID-related hiring freezes. It may be a reflection for the need for flexibility to ensure the presence of counsel at arraignment, or it may be a combination of both. Then in other good news, counsel at arraignment was provided for an estimated total of almost 65,000 cases as a result of statewide funding alone. And I would like to note here that this number is a higher number than the number of new cases that were assigned to attorneys that were hired. And this is, I will present that number later on in the training. Why is that? Because these cases do not only include those cases for which counsel at arraignment was provided by hired attorneys, but also include attorneys who were paid, for instance, by contracts via hourly rates or via stipends to provide representation at arraignment, and also includes, for instance, assigned counsel panel attorneys. Then I would like to present to you what we call some more qualitative information. As you may recall, the progress reports consist of first a couple of questions in which you are asked to provide numbers and facts, and then the last couple of questions on the progress report are these so-called open-ended questions. We ask you to describe, the use of state funds within the areas of counsel at arraignment and the two other areas as well. And we also ask providers to indicate if there were any challenges within those areas. And you were able to give some open answers there. Now, the open answers is what we call the qualitative information. And when we specifically look at that information, we see the following in the area of counsel at arraignment. Since the start of implementation, many providers achieved full arraignment coverage, 24/7, 375 days a year. So that is an impressive accomplishment. In addition, the funding allowed providers to quickly adapt to the COVID-19 pandemic and to purchase the necessary laptops, the necessary cell phones, web cameras, etc., that they needed to shift to remote work. However, not unexpectedly, the COVID-19 pandemic also presented some challenges, and here we discuss the challenges specific to the area of counsel at arraignment. As you all know, arraignments have shifted because of COVID-19 from in-person to virtual, and that came with some challenges. And providers mentioned inconsistent wireless connectivity. They also mentioned the lack of coordination with court schedules, particularly in rural areas. And more generally, they discussed, the differences between communicating with your clients in a virtual manner versus an in-person manner. And some people seem to indicate that effective communication with clients was just a little bit easier in an in-person context versus a virtual context. So that was another point that came through these open answers. Right, so then we arrive at the second area of interest, which involves caseload relief. First, again, I would like to present to you a couple of numbers. And this is one of the other impressive numbers. Statewide, 489 new attorneys have been hired since the start of implementation. So in the past 3 years, with the state funding that is available to you. Now, this number includes those new attorneys that were hired who provide counsel at arraignment that I just reported on. However, it also includes new attorneys hired that are not providing counsel at arraignment, but focus on other tasks. One example of that is, for instance, the hire of an attorney as an administrator of a program. Usually, or well, not always, but what we do see is that administrators of a program do not always provide counsel at arraignments because they are more tasked with the administrative duties of running a program. In total, an estimated 57,000 and almost 500 cases were represented by attorneys who were hired with the state funding in the last year. And so that is another impressive number. And when we focus on the last year only, and we focus on new attorneys hired only in the last year and not in the last 3 years, as I reported before, we see that 138 new attorneys were hired. So again, during the COVID-19 pandemic, 138 new attorneys were hired in the past year. What we also see here, similar to what I reported before, is that the majority of these new attorney hires were placed on contract, and that proportion was actually much higher than the proportion of attorneys that were placed on contract compared to last year's report. Again, this shift in hiring might be a reflection of, the pandemic-related hiring freeze or some other need for flexibility. So what is important here in the area of caseload relief to really emphasize, I think, is that although the COVID-19 pandemic slightly slowed the hiring of new attorneys in the past year, because when we compare the numbers, we see in the past year, we hired 138 new attorneys. However, in previous years, the average annual number of new attorney hires was 175. But taken into account the COVID-19 pandemic, the number was higher than ILS expected in light of the hiring freezes that many localities implemented. And also, even when hiring was possible, the challenges, of course, associated with hiring and onboarding new staff amidst the pandemic. So more numbers on caseload relief, now focusing on non-attorney positions. Statewide, 257 non-attorneys were hired since the start of implementation. So again, in the past 3 years. However, here we see a different picture that emerges. Because when we look at the numbers, we see that there were only 9 more non-attorneys hired compared to the last year. So this number was not as high as we would have liked to see. However, again, within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, it was not unexpected. To give you an idea of what these non-attorney hires statewide consist of, I present you here with a pie chart. And from that pie chart, you can conclude that the overwhelming majority of non-attorney hires are administrative support staff persons. And then the remainder is kind of evenly divided between social workers, investigators, and then the category that we call other non-attorney positions. Then we'll move on to providers' experiences, the open answers they gave us in the second part of the progress report regarding caseload relief. What we saw is that the main struggle reported were challenges related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And more specifically, challenges included things like this. For instance, providers spoke about a greater number of cases, the so-called workloads, due to a backlog of cases because of court closures, limited appearances, and a rise in new case assignments as courts open back up and court activity increases. And while the number of new case assignments in 2020 was actually lower than in 2019, providers said workloads increased because the cases are not resolved as quickly because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and therefore cases tend to stay in an attorney's portfolio for a longer time. Some providers expressed that there was this concern that the state funding would either be reduced or eliminated because of the pandemic. And that concern impacted statewide implementation in the following ways. There was, at some providers, a delay in hiring new employees or purchasing necessary technology. However, the good news is that more recently, these concerns have been going away because, first of all, ILS has been able to fully reimburse localities on all claims during the pandemic. And second, the governor's proposed fiscal year 2021-2022 budget and the final enacted budget included full funding for year 4 of the statewide implementation. All right, moving on to the last area of interest, which is the overall improvement of quality of public defense. First, again, I would like to present you with some numbers. So quality improvements, as you know, consists of different aspects. And one of the aspects of overall quality improvement concerns supervision, the creation of supervisory positions and creating the opportunity for attorneys, for less experienced attorneys to, seek for advice with more experienced attorneys. When we look at the numbers there, we see that 66 new attorneys were hired who supervise the work of others or who provide training or mentoring. Another aspect of quality improvement involves attorney training. And from the numbers, we see that 350 training events were hosted, sponsored, or co-sponsored by the state funding in the last year. And in addition, for almost 2,800 attorneys, their attendance at training events, so think about registration fees, travel reimbursements or accommodations, was supported by the state funding. What I would like to mention in addition to that is that we also saw that due to the COVID-19 pandemic, almost all trainings were hosted virtually, which actually meant that significantly fewer statewide funds were used for covering costs related to travel and accommodation. And in addition, CLE providers such as the New York State Defenders Association offered many of their virtual CLE courses free of charge, also resulting in less statewide funding needed for training. Another aspect of quality improvement is increasing the use of expert and investigative services in cases. And what we see there is that statewide, a total of almost $570,000 was spent on contracted expert services, and another $261,000 was spent on contracted investigative services in the past year only, during the COVID-19 pandemic. And compared with last year's numbers, the average annual use of statewide funding significantly increased, with 89% for contracted expert services and 113% for contracted investigative services. And the latter means that it more than doubled, basically. So that is impressive as well. Then you might recall this when you filled out the progress report. We not only ask about how many dollars do you spend towards the use of expert services or investigative services, but we also ask, in how many cases do you use expert services or investigative services? And in the case of expert services, they were provided as a result of statewide funding in 1,680 cases. And for investigative services, they were provided as a result of statewide funding in 5,656 cases. What I would like to mention here is that these numbers include expert and investigative services that were provided by both salaried as well as contracted experts and investigators. And I mention this because the number I reported on the last slide, the dollar amount, they only pertain to contracted services and leave out whatever money was spent towards salary services in that sense. So that's the difference between these two types of numbers. Then I would like to, again, provide you also with some more qualitative information in the area of overall quality improvement. And this is what we got from the providers, what you guys reported to us in those open answer questions. First of all, with regarding to training, we saw that attorneys took advantage of training opportunities when possible. And providers also reported that funding allowed for the creation of additional supervisory positions and second chair supports. Providers also mentioned that they contracted with and hired a variety of non-attorney professionals, including but not limited to investigators, social workers, administrative support staff, etc. And this went hand in hand with a couple of successes. And as successes, providers mentioned that this helped positive case outcomes. It also helped providing clients with a broader range of assistance and also to realize a more holistic approach to client representation. On the other hand, the hires of non-attorney professionals also brought some challenges. So although non-attorney professionals were hired, sometimes there were some challenges in the areas of visibility, availability, and willingness to utilize these resources, which basically means, okay, so we have these non-attorney professionals on staff, but now we also need to make sure that everybody is, one, aware of that, knows how to approach them, and knows how to be able to use them. And some providers also mentioned that, you know, the willingness to use these resources sometimes differed a little bit between individuals. Another challenge that was mentioned was difficulties in hiring and retaining qualified candidates for these positions. And lastly, we also noted that there was a challenge in terms of that there was some resistance from some judges and magistrates over the use of support services. And in this example, it specifically related to expert and investigator services. Then some more providers' experiences I would like to share. What also came through your comments was that client communication during the pandemic was more challenging. It was difficult, especially during virtual arraignments. And one of the greatest challenges that was mentioned was hiring and retaining qualified attorneys. This was not a new challenge. It already existed pre-pandemic. and more specifically, finding attorneys willing to relocate to rural areas, and also attrition due to non-competitive salaries was mentioned as one of the things that related to the difficulties with hiring and retaining qualified attorneys. However, some additional challenges arose due to the pandemic. Some counties were implementing hiring freezes, salary caps. Also, some counties refused to approve new hires due to the perception that case numbers were low as a result of COVID-19 and the court closures. However, in reality, or according to providers and attorneys' perceptions, this was quite different, as I reported earlier. Lastly, I would like to notice that providers also mentioned the immediate need for better technology for remote work. And also, as I mentioned before, some tech issues related to remote work and also to discovery reform. The good news here in terms of technology is that we did see that more providers statewide are using an electronic case management system. So that number is still going up. And of course, that is very beneficial, not only for providers, but also for ILS, because usually the use of an electronic case management system makes it a little bit easier to meet ILS's data reporting requirements and to actually report the data to ILS. So this was a whole wave of numbers and information. And so I'm sorry for that, but I wanted to give you a complete understanding of the highlights of what we found. But concluding, what does this mean? What can we identify as basically the take-home message from this year's data collection and this annual report on the performance measures? I think an important conclusion to share with you here is that statewide contract funding allowed providers of mandated criminal defense representation to not only stay afloat during a global pandemic, but also make real improvements in public defense reform. And this is illustrated by a couple of examples, such as the quick adaptation to remote working due to COVID-19, because of the use of funding to purchase the necessary laptops, cell phones, and web cameras. And more generally also, just because of the mere fact that despite the pandemic, implementation continued. And we saw that especially with a couple of numbers. For instance, the number of attorney hires in the past year. 138 attorney hires were made in the past year during the COVID-19 pandemic. Also, what we saw was that there was a significant increase in the use of state funding for contracted expert and contracted investigative services. All right, so this was my overview, and this is in short what is in the Performance Measures Annual Report. However, of course, I will invite you to ask any questions you may have in a minute, but if you are interested to read the full Performance Measures Annual Report, please know that it is available via our website, and I included the link to the full report right here. Another thing I would like to point out to you is one specific appendix, which is Appendix D. And this appendix includes key performance measures data at the county level. So in contrast to those aggregate numbers, those numbers that are basically about statewide what happened, that I presented today, you can also look up numbers per county. And so if you're interested, please know that when you go to the full Performance Measures Annual Report and you look up that Appendix D, you can just look up the county. And if you're interested, this is what Appendix D looks like. This is just an excerpt of the start of the appendix. But here you see on the left-hand side, the counties listed, and then the numerical responses to the questions, of course, presented at the county level. All right. The only thing that I want to mention now is that the next data officer training we have scheduled for August 12th at 11 a.m. Of course, you will receive reminders about that and more detailed information. And I think this is a great moment to invite any questions you may have about the performance measures annual report. And I believe I saw something popping up in the chat. So Lucelle, let me know.
I think you're muted, Lucelle.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, we have a question from Adam Schultz. He says, you mentioned that spending was down due to concerns about reimbursement. If a provider doesn't use their allotted amount of funds in a given year, do they have access to those unused funds later on?
Okay, well, this is a good question and a very practical question too. I'm also looking a little bit at Melissa. My understanding is that some of these unused funds can roll over to the next year, but Melissa, maybe you can provide a little bit more detail.
I'm actually going to see, I think Claire Zartarian is on with us, and I think it would be appropriate for her to answer that question for Adam. Claire, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. So Adam, this is a great question, and unused funding remains available within the line that it has been budgeted for. So the unused funding does not disappear if it's not spent by the end of the budget year. I hope that answers your question, but if you have more follow-up questions, feel free to email me. I'll put my email in the chat box.
All right, thank you so much, Claire, for your insight. Any other questions at this moment? Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. All right, I think I must have been crystal clear. I don't know.
It looks like you are.
I have one question that is not specifically performance measure related, but came up when I had the update to my DCMS. Our county, and I think other counties may be doing this, have VTL diversion programs. So for a purpose of closing a case, should I have the NYSDA add another closing component for diversion like we have for drug treatment courts for purposes of opening and closing cases? Or should we just put that a plea was entered and just leave it open for your purposes, even though they would be vouchered until they've completed their diversion and then close it that way? I guess that tried to simplify the question because I'm sure there are other counties that have this coming up.
Right, we do, Diane, this is Melissa. We do have a number of different counties who've raised that specific question. And what it sometimes seems to come down to is the difference between an ACP and an institutional provider. And to your point, I think that for ACPs, they tend to close it sooner because the attorney is submitting their voucher, but in some institutional provider offices, it remains open because there's no voucher to be submitted. Let me get back to you on that. Darlene has in the past sent us a request for kind of a definition of what a closed case is, and I want to go back and look at our response to that. It might have been related to the ILS 195 specifically, which I think is what your question is related to. So I'll get back to you on that, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? Obviously, we're also available by email. You can just send your questions or concerns to performance@ils.ny.gov. So please know that you can always do that as well.
Would you be able to provide us with a copy of your slideshow? Make that available on your website?
Yes, thank you, Diane, for bringing that up. Yes, so that's actually a very good point. I should have let you know that. After this training, we will upload the recording of this training session as well as the slideshow to the website. So you should expect that to be available sometime next week, I guess.
Yes. Yeah, so if there's nothing else, I think we can let class out early today. But we want to thank everyone, and I'd like to thank Nick Watson, who is our data scientist here at ILS. He too had to wait nearly a year to come on board because of the hiring freeze. So he's our second internal data officer, and he is hosting today's meeting and recording it for us. So thank you, Nick. You did a great job. We kept it all together. Yeah, and if that's it, then thank everybody for coming. And like we said, if you have questions, you can send them to performance@ils.ny.gov. And if you have questions on anything else related to the ILS 195, you can send them to data. And all of our contact information is on the website if you like to. And you will all be hearing from Riley at some point in the next month or so. So take care and stay safe and stay cool.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.